Hello there, friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today, we are going to talk about being stuck in a HSP, highly sensitive person, perfectionism loop. I think this is something that a lot of you are going to relate to, and we're going to talk about not only what that loop is, but how to get ourselves out of it. When we look at the definition of perfectionism, it is a refusal to accept any standard that is short of perfection. Now, the problem with this is that much of being human and much of life is imperfect. And so when we are stuck in this place where we're refusing to accept things any less than perfect, we are literally setting ourselves up to fail. The reason that is so tricky is because as highly sensitive people, we can get very stuck in that feeling of self-criticism when we feel like we haven't measured up, but we're trying to measure up to a standard that was really higher and loftier than was really reasonable. So I want you to imagine, a scenario where you've chosen to stop trying to be a perfectionist, right? Maybe you have had this recognition of, oh, I am actually now being harmed in the pursuit of perfection because I'm exhausted, burnt out, suffering in some way. But you try to do it and your body kind of pulls you back to doing that perfectionist thing again. And so it can feel like we're just like I said, stuck in this loop. It's not that being a highly sensitive person and being a perfectionist go hand in hand. We are not necessarily perfectionists when we're highly sensitive people. I also think it's important to recognize that perfectionism doesn't always show up the same way in across different areas of our lives. So I am definitely not a perfectionist when it comes to tidiness. I'm quite a messy person by default. I like it when things are tidy. I'm just not very good at doing it. But I am definitely, I have a tendency towards perfectionism in other ways and in other places. And so when you think of perfectionism, you might have a kind of stereotyped view of what that is. But as we talk through this, it might become more apparent how that can show up in different places. It's interesting as highly sensitive people, even if you wouldn't consider yourself a perfectionist, it's probably true that you hold yourself to very high standards. And if you like that language better than perfectionist, just go with that. But it is often very true that HSPs will we will hold ourselves to much higher standards than we might expect other people to hold themselves to. And so there is this sense that, if we just try hard enough, we can do all of it, everything, and we can do it to 110%. The thing that happens is that we are praised for that way of being. So I want to kind of talk about that because if we want to think about how do we get out of this perfectionist loop, we have to understand why we're in it in the first place. And so we're going to take a little trip back down memory lane to when we were kids. And as a highly sensitive person, there's a very good chance that you learned really early and really clearly that when you do things well, when you do things to a high standard, it makes other people happy. And you get praised, and when you get praised, you feel loved, and when you feel loved, you feel safe. The reality is that is our nervous system's number one job, right? Its number one imperative is to make sure that you stay safe and that you stay alive. And if you do a really good job at things, and doing that really good job at things makes you feel safe and happy, then your nervous system is going to be like, I know a really good strategy for staying alive. And side note, staying alive can include saying socially welcomed and accepted and loved. That way is to work really hard and make other people happy. Let's make sure we always do that so that we stay loved and we stay safe. Now, that is kind of a simplistic way of looking at things, but it rings true, right? We can see this, if you're a parent, you can probably see some of the ways that your own kids do this, even if you haven't consciously tried to create that pattern, right? It is a very human thing to do. And it's not just us HSPs that do that, but I think that HSPs are often very kind of deeply impacted by that because we're also so aware of how other people feel. And so you can sense that, being pleased. You can sense that other people are pleased and happy with you, but you can also sense the opposite, right? When I fail, when I didn't do enough, when I didn't measure up, when I wasn't perfect, they maybe did withhold love, affection, praise. And so I didn't feel as safe. And so that is, programmed on some level into our system. And so if we fast forward today, when you're determined that you're not going to strive so hard to be perfect because it's taking a toll on how you feel, you might make that decision, but then find that when you go to leave the bed unmade or leave the dishes undone or not proofread that email for the 80th time or whatever it is that's your less than perfect response, your nervous system might be like, well, hang on, friend. Do you remember that we have to be perfect to stay loved? Right? It's not going to use that language, but that's what it's going to feel like. And the brakes are going to be on and you're going to be scrambling. No, let me just proofread that one more time. Let me just quickly make the bed. Let me quickly just do those dishes. We find ourselves kind of being pulled back into that loop. And so it might feel like you are trying to do the thing and you just can't seem to get out of that cycle. And it might be one of two things happens, right? The cycle can look one of two ways. Either you go to be imperfect and you feel deeply uncomfortable and therefore sort of jump back into the perfectionist loop, or you try to be imperfect and you kind of go with it because you're like, yeah, I really don't have the energy to continue to strive and perform in this kind of way. But then you're spending the next 5 hours beating up on yourself and criticizing yourself because you didn't do it perfectly, because you feel uncomfortable. And so there's sort of two loops, and we might loop into one and then into the other, but we might be finding it really hard to get out of the loop altogether. And it pays to try to get out of the loop, because the thing is that it can be endless. We can literally run ourselves into the ground by continuing to perpetuate the belief that we have to be perfect in order to be enough. Because that's what it ultimately boils down to. That's ultimately what we are trying to prove to ourselves or to someone else. And we might not have the awareness of that, but that is, at the end of the day, what lots of things boil down to as humans. Am I being included? Am I being loved? Do I feel safe? And if being perfect gets us there, then why would our nervous system want us to throw that away? It doesn't make any sense. And so this is where maybe then we're throwing up our hands and we're like, well, my efforts are for nothing, right? I either feel crappy about myself or I'm stuck doing just as much work as I was doing before because I can't stop myself. It's kind of almost like this compulsion. So what do we do? Are we stuck there? No, we're not. I've got a couple of tips for you. So the first tip is around safety. We know that the nervous system's primary objective is to keep you alive and to keep you safe. And if we have piles upon piles of evidence collected over decades, which is really what we're talking about here, that doing things to 110% quality is the only way that we stay safe, then of course your nervous system is going to put on the brakes when you don't do that, right? Or it's going to remind you not to do it again by throwing up this self-criticism. We're going to kind of get stuck in that loop of, oh, I should have, oh, I'm terrible, this is not good enough, etc., etc. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to provide a sense of safety for our nervous system while we're doing the hard thing. Because one of the pieces of evidence that, this is okay, this is safe to do, that's going to come from successfully getting through doing the imperfect thing and not dying, right? Not feeling threatened. So how do we do that though if the very act of not being perfect makes us feel unsafe? And that's where we have to incorporate other forms of evidence that we're safe. My favorite way to do that is to remember to breathe. And so if I have decided, I'm going to use the example of like not making the bed. Now, I am one of those people who has probably made the bed less times in their adult life than the other way around. Like I actually don't make my bed very often. I really like the way it looks when I do, but I've never really been that bothered by it because nobody sees the bedroom. So it really doesn't matter. But I am going to use that as an example. So if you're like me and you never make the bed, you can probably think of a different example, but we're going to use that example. So I have decided that that's where I'm going to play with dropping my perfectionism. I'm not going to make the bed this morning. And I'm standing by the bed and I'm noticing, oh my God, it would just take me 2 seconds. It would take me 2 seconds just to pull that up and fluff that pillow, and I would feel so much better for it. And we could do that, right? That's absolutely one possibility. But if we're working with dropping perfectionism, it might be an interesting place to start. And so how am I going to prove to myself that it's safe to do that? I'm going to anchor my feet into the floor and I'm going to take a few slow, long breaths. And that is going to tell my nervous system, oh, actually it's okay. We only breathe this way when we're safe. It's impossible to breathe this way when we are under threat. So I'm going to send a really clear signal to my nervous system that we are okay. And that is something that we can use in any kind of scenario, right? Anchoring into the support of the floor, the support of the earth, and anchoring into the support of our breath. The second tip that I want to share with you today is also one of the ways that we can show our system safety. And so it's kind of a continuation of tip 1, but I'm going to make it tip 2 because it's something I want to talk about a bit more deeply. And that is something that if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you will have heard me talk about a million times: self-compassion. Now, if we are going to prove to our system that we are safe, then we have to have a way of interrupting the self-criticism that's going to pop up when we are imperfect. Because the thing about criticism is that if somebody was standing behind you, right? So let's just use the making the bed example. I've chosen not to make the bed. I've grounded, I've done my breathing. I'm like, okay, I'm safe. This is okay. I can walk away without the bed made. But then my partner walks in and he says, what, you're not making the bed? Oh my gosh, you're so lazy. I'm going to have a reaction to that. That's not going to feel very good. That is not any different to you saying the same things to yourself in terms of the level of threat that provokes. I mean, it might be a little bit different, right? There is definitely a looming sense of threat when somebody says something like that to you. But what I'm trying to point out is that you saying those things to yourself is also a threat. It is also going to be perceived by your nervous system as something that has to be overcome, eliminated. Like it's a sign that, oh, we've done something here that's not quite right. We need to protect ourselves from this. And so self-criticism is going to be very disruptive to our quest to sort of drop the perfectionism, because it is going to try to convince us to go and do the thing that we were trying not to do. And it is going to, of its own accord, kick off like a fight-flight response. It's going to have an impact on the nervous system and the nervous system's desire to keep us safe. And so self-compassion comes in because we don't want to be stuck in that criticism loop. We don't want to be kind of self-perpetuating this notion that we're not good enough because we chose not to do this thing perfectly, like making the bed. And so self-compassion becomes critical. It becomes like a really crucial part of this process, because self-compassion says, whew, this is hard. I feel really uncomfortable not doing this perfectly. I feel really uncomfortable leaving this undone. And I've chosen to try because I recognize that a lot of my energy is being leaked in trying to be perfect when that's not really a reasonable expectation for me to have of myself. And so I'm choosing to leave this undone, even though it feels uncomfortable. And I'm choosing to be kind to myself in the face of that. Very different to saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm leaving this. I'm so lazy. It would only take 2 seconds. And what does that mean? And what would people think if they saw it? And blah, 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 blah. Self-compassion changes the inner landscape, the reaction, the nervous system response. It just feels completely different. And that is why it's a critical part of this. it's not always that comfortable to do. And I know that I have had clients say to me before, oh, it feels a little weird. I agree. I understand that. And yet there's really no denying that it is incredibly powerful. And so we want to talk to ourselves like we would talk to somebody that we really loved, somebody that we really wanted to understand. Hey, you doing this thing does not equate to how much I love you and how much you're worth and how much you are a wonderful human, right? That does not hinge on your capacity to make or not make this bed. And so we want to have that sweet, loving conversation with ourselves and acknowledge that it's hard to do what it is that we're doing. And we have to have those conversations with ourselves too when we feel like we have failed, right? Or we haven't measured up to a standard that we've upheld. Self-compassion comes in all of those places so that we're not adding to our internal angst by being our own worst critic. Now, this isn't to say, right, like when we think about extracting ourselves from a perfectionist loop as highly sensitive people, this isn't to say that we are trying not to care about the quality of anything that we do ever again. Obviously not. We have high standards because we care. We care about impact. We care about outcomes. We care about how other people feel. That's wonderful. They're beautiful things. The key is to remind ourselves that we do not have infinite resources and infinite energy. And what can happen when we're stuck in perfectionism and we're stuck in these loops is that we are prioritizing those perfect outcomes over our own well-being. And we are always going to be the loser in that equation, right? Because the thing that we're seeking to be perfect over, often those things are inanimate, right? Like the bed doesn't care if it's made, right? But we are the ones who kind of lose out if we are constantly prioritizing perfection over our well-being and how we feel. And the reality of our resources, right? Our energy, our time, our money, everything. And so the temptation, of course, is that we swing the pendulum, as far one way as it was the other. And it's like, well, nothing matters. And it's like, well, how do we find something in the middle, right? Yes, exert energy and put yourself into things that matter to you. But don't do it in a way that harms you or takes from you things that you do not have to give. I think that's it. I hope that lands. I hope that helps. And if you feel like you're stuck in a bit of a perfectionist loop as a HSP, I hope that this helps you kind of start to find your way out. As always, you can absolutely come and find me and ask questions. If you're here with me on YouTube, you can leave a comment. If you are listening in your ears, you can come and find me over on Instagram. My DMs are always open. I'm at Erica Webb _SelfKind. And if you want to learn any more about working with me, either one-on-one or inside the SelfKind Hub, then you can head to my website, ericawebb.com.au. All right, friends, until next week, keep being kind to yourselves, and I will chat with you then.